Times and Seasons, a program dealing with significant issues of public concern.
Children, this planet's most valuable natural resource. Soon these children will be parents. Most of them will raise their children in the same way they themselves were raised. For some, this will mean tragedy. This is a program about child abuse. It will answer many questions about the problem. We'll learn what child abuse is, how big the problem is, why it exists, and what each of us can do to help prevent this global tragedy. We'll talk with some of the world's leading authorities on the subject. In Washington, D.C., Presidential Cabinet member Dr. Louis Sullivan is Secretary of Health and Human Services.
Yes, child abuse is a major problem, unfortunately, in our society. We have an estimated 1 million or so cases of child abuse that occur annually in our country, of which approximately 100,000 are actually serious. And among those, we have some 1,000 to 1,200 or so fatalities from severe cases of child abuse. So it is a very serious problem in our society.
In Canada, clinical psychologist Richard Berry is director of the government Sexual Abuse Family Education and Treatment Program.
1/3 to, in some instances, 60, 70% of children are being exposed to various forms of abuse. So it's a major problem in terms of just the numbers. It's a very serious problem in terms of the issues that it creates. It becomes something that sort of self-perpetuates if you can't break that chain.
At the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children in London, Susan Creighton is Senior Research Officer.
Up until recently, we've been mainly concerned about the physical abuse of children. But now in the UK, we're getting very concerned about the sexual abuse of children. And we're also much more interested now in what I term as multiple forms of abuse: physical, neglect, sexual and emotional abuse, and combinations of them. We're recognizing that it's not nearly so simple a problem as we originally thought, or so clear-cut a problem as we originally thought.
In Sydney, Australia, Dr. Kim Oates is Professor of Pediatrics at the University of Sydney Medical School.
Yes, I think as far as paediatrics goes, it's one of the major paediatric problems, and probably one of the most serious problems in terms of the long-term effects it has on abused children, affecting the way they grow up, the way they relate to other people, and the way they eventually become parents and bring up their own children.
Throughout history, the way in which children have been viewed by the society in which they lived has varied greatly, but much of it has not been good. The ancient Greeks did distinguish between children and adults, but the philosopher teachers of the time felt it necessary to beat their pupils in order to break their will, so they would become submissive. The Romans viewed children as property and gave the father the right to beat or even kill his children as he wished. In the medieval world, the idea of childhood did not exist. As soon as the child could live without the constant attention of his mother, he was assimilated into all levels of adult society. Cruel corporal punishment was justified by the conviction that it was necessary to maintain discipline and expel evil spirits. In the 18th century, a new image of man and society began to develop. Children were regarded as being unable to defend themselves and as needing special treatment in order to enter the adult world. However, the traditional techniques of child rearing were still used and were, most often, cruel and disastrous. The Industrial Revolution brought on even greater hardships for children, and for the disadvantaged social classes as well. In France and England, infants were sent to wet nurses from their very first day. But wet nurses were also known as angel makers, and infanticide by exposure and abandonment was practiced widely throughout Europe well into the 19th century. The fate of home-reared children was little better. In the beginning of the 19th century, families of the underclass had no choice but to put their children out for cheap labor in factories or mines. But despite this long and bleak history, it has only been during the past several years that child abuse, especially within families, has been recognized as a serious worldwide problem. Many of us are confused by the term child abuse. We are not entirely sure of its meaning. And even for the professionals who work in this area constantly, there is no simple definition. Dr. Ann Cohn is Executive Director of the National Committee for the Prevention of Child Abuse, a volunteer organization in Chicago.
Child abuse is actually a complex problem. We're talking about children who are physically beaten, battered in one way or another, really physically injured. We're talking about children who are sexually abused. That can be any one of a number of different forms of sexual molestation, including the use of children in child pornography or the use of children in other forms of sexual activity. It includes physical neglect, where children are simply not provided with their daily needs of food and shelter and clothing and in some cases love and attention. And it can also include emotional abuse, emotional maltreatment, usually thought of as verbal abuse, where children may be told day in and day out, "You're terrible, you're never going to amount to anything, I hate you, I wish you were never born."
Dr. James Garbarino is president of the Erickson Institute for Advanced Study in Child Development in Chicago. Dr. Garbarino expands on the meaning of child abuse and emphasizes that it's the community that sets the standard and decides what is wrong, dangerous, or harmful to children.
Specifically, in the United States, that tends to mean that assaulting children for the purposes of discipline in ways that leave bruises, welts, that run the risk of breaking bones, that run the risk of serious injury, hitting children in the head, hitting children with objects. Those things in most communities are coming to be seen as examples of physical child abuse. Certainly, the more severe the attack, attacking with the fist, causing injuries that would require medical attention, those clearly are physical child abuse in the United States.
Yeah, it's difficult to give a simple explanation because child abuse is such a complex area. But it can be broken down into several smaller groups. The physical abuse of children, the sexual abuse of children, the neglect of children, and the emotional abuse of children. Those four areas cover most of the spectrum of child abuse. And in each of those areas, it's where children are exploited or injured or neglected by people older than them who are in a position of power.
In Brussels, at the University Hospital for Children, Dr. Catherine Marneff is director of the Confidential Doctor Center.
There are different sorts of abuse. About 1/3 of the children is physically abused. The children have broken bones or subdural hematoma, or they are burned, or you also have a lot of children, and I think it's about half of the children that are neglected. They are physically neglected or emotionally neglected. It means that parents have no attention for them, don't give them enough food while they have enough money to give them enough food. They are really left to themselves, and they are not stimulated or encouraged to grow on several levels. And then you have a new phenomenon. It's not so new for the United States, but new for Europe since 2 or 3 years, is that we are confronted with the problem of sexual abuse.
Child sexual abuse is when someone takes advantage of a position of trust, particularly an adult or an older person in relationship to a child, and uses that relationship for their own purposes. And usually that's some form of sexual gratifications, and the abuse can vary in terms of its explicitness, whether or not it involves penetration or just exposing a child to pornography, or involving a child in photographing, the child, but somehow the person in a position of trust getting their own personal gratification out of that.
We also are concerned about emotional or psychological abuse, which in most communities now is a concept that is in law and practice, and that means vicious attacks on the self-concept of the child's self-esteem, locking children up in dark places, tying them down, belittling them to the point that they feel are worthless.
In Paris, Dr. Dominique Giraudet is a pediatrician who works with young mothers who have no family support. She also works with infants and younger children with family problems.
We see very frequently, not in this institution, but in the hospital where I work. I work also a small part in the pediatric unit. We see a lot of very young babies, under 2 years, who come there because they are battered. And it can be very dangerous, even for their health. You know, we have a lot of brain damage and bones damage also.
Literally millions of children throughout the world are tragically abused. It's tempting to want to believe that it's happening away from where you are, that it's going on somewhere else, that it's happening to somebody else, that it doesn't affect you. But it's much closer than you may think.
Well, it's predominantly in the home. That's where children spend most of their time. That's where most of their conflicts are played out.
At the Department of Family and Community Services for New South Wales, Australia, John Gavahan is Executive Officer at the Child Protection and Family Crisis Service.
Most abuse of children is within the family, that is within the people known to the child, aunts, uncles, parents, grandparents, de factos, step de factos, these sorts of relationships where there's basically a mother figure, father figure, and most of the abuse of children is within the family.
Rosemary Sinclair, a fellow Australian, is president of the National Association for the Prevention of Child Abuse and Neglect, or NAPCAN. She helps clarify even more where child abuse takes place and how society is affected.
A lot of people assume quite wrongly that abuse of children occurs only in poor areas, poverty-stricken areas, and it's been conclusively proved that child abuse in all its forms occurs in all levels of society, knows no socio-economic boundaries at all. And this is a message we in Australia, NAPCAN particularly, is trying to get across to the wider community, that child abuse in all its forms is very detrimental to children and to their families and to society as a whole.
Before we can even begin to think about solutions to the problems of child abuse, we need to have some understanding of its causes. In Paris, psychologist Albert Crevillet is another of the many professionals searching for answers.
Well, the problem of child abuse is very complex, more than some studies we can have show to us, because it's easy to describe the consequences and the external facts. But for me, what is very important is to try to understand what's going on into the person who acts this kind of behaving. So my approach is on the inner personality of the abusive parent and understand what's going in himself that makes him to act this way.
What we notice here in the clinical practice is that all abusive parents have had a terrible childhood.
And this is the complication. I mean, how did he construct his own personality that makes him to maltreat his own child? And outside the family is a wonderful person. I mean, as you and me and anyone else. Nobody who would say that that person is an abusive parent. Why?
Any one of us, when put under pressure, tends to revert to the child-rearing practices that we know. And of course, the ones that we know best are the ones that we were exposed to ourselves.
Pediatrician Dr. Margaret Lynch is director of the Newcomen Child Development Centre in London and senior lecturer at the University of London.
I think that we all, to a certain extent, are at risk. I think that anybody put in for them particularly difficult circumstances of caring for a child that might be particularly difficult to care for without any of these support systems we've been talking about, then I think probably any one of us could be pushed to physically abuse a child, to lose our temper with a child.
The problem with children is that they are the weakest of society, and that when you are angry and irritated, you will not aggress the policeman at the corner of the street, but rather your child, or if you are a man, your wife.
Well, there's a whole variety of things. Certainly stress is one of them. Families under stress have difficulty coping with the normal child-rearing activity. Some children are very difficult to manage, and some children get on people's nerves, and families that are under stress are more likely to lash out. Poverty's certainly got a link with physical abuse. The problem with that is that people sometimes assume that where there's no poverty, there won't be abuse. And of course abuse occurs throughout the social spectrum, but poverty's a major stress which adds to abuse.
Another thing that we see increasingly, and it's what concerns me the most, is that the abuse of drugs and alcohol is so closely intertwined with problems of child abuse. You see it particularly in the most serious cases of child abuse and in those cases where children die. Last year in New York City, over 80% of the child abuse fatalities were drug abuse related. Crack and cocaine are just wreaking havoc in children's lives today, and it's very tragic.
Much of the tragedy of child abuse is related to the value we place on our children, compared with how much value we place on our own material success. Too often in our highly competitive societies, our children are very low on the scale of importance.
I think that children have been devalued over the years, and children aren't very precious anymore, and their childhoods aren't precious. Nobody appreciates that. I think there's a lot of influence on family life, adverse influence from television. I think the family is very much threatened at the moment. 1 in 3 divorce rate in this country. And since that has happened, young people aren't growing up to be proper parents.
Another major and obvious link to child abuse is the general lack of virtually any training or preparation to be parents.
We're very concerned in the NSPCC about preparing people for parenthood. Preparation for parenthood. We think that in some ways people go into parenthood largely in ignorance. Perhaps it's a good thing in some cases that you do. But that they should be aware that children are demanding. They are an enormous responsibility. You don't go into it lightly. You have to commit yourself if you're going to have children.
A lot of young people get married, treat children as status symbols, don't realise the emotional input that one has to put into bringing up a child. And, you know, a child is something that you can't take back if you don't like it, like you can take a Christmas present back. The children then becomes the person that holds the key, that locks the parents into a situation. The child becomes the jailer, in fact, and the child is in a no-win situation, absolutely, because then the child starts to be abused by the parents who resent this child very much.
All the babies of the world cries, don't want the bottle, touch things everywhere, you know, all the baby of the world. And which is terrible for those parents is that when the baby does something wrong and unpleasant for the parents, those parents think that the baby does it on purpose because they don't love them, because they are bad, those babies. And it's terrible for the parents because they have the feeling that they are bad parents. They know that from the beginning, from their childhood. They know that they are not good people. They do a baby, and this baby is as bad as they are. It is intolerable, you know, unbearable for them to have the feeling to have in front of them a child who is as bad as the feeling they have of themselves.
For most of us, these are difficult and painful problems to face, but there is a positive side. As we learn and get better understanding about the causes of child abuse, we begin to discover solutions. Many of them are quite simple.
We need to get messages out to parents in general that there is no such thing as a perfect parent. And indeed, parenting is the toughest job you'll ever have. And when the big and little stresses of life build up and you're just about to lash out at your kid, it's okay to stop. and take time out. And it's okay to reach out for help. We need to get that message out to people so they feel comfortable reaching out. And we need to put into place places where they can reach out to help.
Reaching out means asking for help. If family isn't available, then there needs to be another way, and that involves all of us.
Nuclear families are broken down, that relatives and in-laws might be hundreds of miles away and difficult to contact. The community is the group of people in the area where the person lives. And one of the things that an organisation, NatCan, I'm associated with in Australia, is interested in developing is sort of neighbour network, where neighbours are encouraged to talk to each other, to take an interest in each other's problems. Local support groups starting to be made on a street-by-street basis, so that when stresses are building up and things are difficult, somebody can say to the person next door or 2 doors down, look, do you mind if I talk over this problem with you? And I think if that sort of thing can happen, then a community spirit can be developed.
All parents need help at some stage, and parenting is, in our view, the most important job there is. And it's the one for which there is no training. And we believe that parenting is very important, parenting education, but help for parents at home. Most people think it's only people in poor areas who need help. All parents need help at some stage. So our Neighbour Network scheme is designed to offer that assistance, time out if you like, for parents, because we recognise that all parents are potential child abusers.
Taking time out is another good way to handle stressful situations with your children. In Toronto, Gladys Rothman is manager of prevention services for the George Hall Centre, an agency which helps families with emotional problems. She offers several practical suggestions. Some may sound familiar.
First of all, I would say before you strike your kid, before you hurt your kid, before you shout at your child, count to 10 is very effective. And just try to detach yourself from the situation, walk away, go to the kitchen, walk around the corner, around the block, and give yourself some time. And then call for help. Call any treatment facility, call your family doctor, call whoever you can reach by phone and say, this is the situation, I need help. I need to be able to deal with my kid. I don't want to hurt my child. I want my child to behave. I want to discipline my child. Can you help me?
Taking time out is something that many professionals recommend during times of stress in the family. The Chicago-based National Committee for the Prevention of Child Abuse has even published posters with several time-out suggestions for worn-out parents. Take a deep breath, and another. Then remember you are the adult. Close your eyes and imagine you're hearing what your child is about to hear. Phone a friend. If someone can watch the children, go outside and take a walk. Hug a pillow. This same group is also responsible for a series of television spots aimed at helping people understand how various forms of child abuse affect the world's greatest natural resource, our children.
Dummy. You're pathetic. You little brass.
Child abuse is also known by some other words.
Jerk. You moron. You're so clumsy.
Words like these can hit as hard as a fist.
You were never born. I hate you.
What you say to your children can determine how they feel about
You
themselves
slob. You're worthless.
and how they feel about you. Get the picture. Stop using words that hurt. Start using words that help.
Children believe what their parents tell them.
You're pathetic. You can't do anything right.
You disgust me. Just shut up.
You can't be my kid.
You're worthless.
Hey, stupid, don't you know how to listen?
You're never going to amount to anything.
Why don't you go find some other place to live?
Words hit as hard as a fist. Stop and listen to what you're saying. You might not believe your ears.
I wish you were never born.
Take time out. Don't take it out on your kid.
Similar efforts in public education about child abuse are going on throughout the world. There is an abundant supply of literature available for your needs and interest wherever you live. During the past several years, we've gained significant understanding about child abuse, but there is still much to learn. Many serious questions remain as the search for answers continues. And as Dr. Crivellet explains, there are no simple answers.
Everyone is a case. Everyone needs a particular answer.
Well, I think the first thing we've learnt that it's common. And I think public education about the area, responsible public education, is one of the most important things that can be done. Once the public understands the problem, then I think the public has a responsibility to say this sort of behaviour is no longer acceptable. And people have to stop saying it's a doctor's problem or it's a social worker's problem. It's not their problem, it's not a police problem, it's not a lawyer's problem, it's a problem that everybody in the community has, and it's something that the community as a whole has to face.
It may be a difficult thing to ask and to do, but eventually we must learn to love one another, to really care, if we expect to give our children a real future.
Well, I think the way we teach people to love one another is to show them concretely what that means. It means spending time with them. It means putting their interest high on our list of priorities. It means if we want them to be gentle, to treat them in a gentle fashion. We don't hit people and say, now stop hitting and be gentle. We show them kind, positive ways. That's the reason why I think we need to stop hitting children generally. Children need to see adults who say, look, I may be angry, but I can find other ways of dealing with my anger. I may want to make you do something, but I can find other ways.
A number of Scandinavian countries have forbidden parents to physically hit their children. Now, a lot of people thought that was a strange law, but the intent behind that law was for a whole generation of children to grow up realising that you don't solve problems by physical violence. And that seems to be what's happening. And in fact, even more quickly than the Scandinavians thought would happen, the incidence of child physical abuse in those countries has fallen.
I tell children when I talk to them that they are people, they have a voice, and they should make their voice heard in a very constructive and calm way, and that if nobody is listening to them, then they must find somebody who will. And I tell them that we're behind them 100%, and that we always will be.
Child abuse is a complex problem with numerous causes. It has plagued society for centuries, but it is only now recognized as an epidemic in society, and concerned people throughout the world are deciding to do something about it. A good deal is known about its causes and what to do once abuse has occurred. It is now time to work towards its prevention, and child abuse is a problem that everybody can get involved in. It shouldn't hurt to be a child.
The program you have just seen is part of a series of programs dealing with significant issues of public concern. Times and Seasons is a production of The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.